Gold Trails and Ghost Towns with Mike Roberts and Bill Barlee.
Welcome to Gold Trails and Ghost Towns. I'm Mike Roberts with our tour guide, Bill Barlee, to the southern part of British Columbia, northern United States, and even beyond that. We usually talk about mining and prospecting on this program. We're making a bit of a change now. We're not dealing with mining and prospecting today.
Well, in some respects that's true, Mike. We're on the old Kettle Valley Railroad, and it is, I think, one of the great lines of the Pacific Slope. And, you know, this is not just my opinion. People who've studied engineering all across the globe agree. But, you know, it is connected with mining, too, because there were two great railroads who wanted this route. One was the Great Northern, and that was the Great Northern. The head of the Great Northern was a guy called James J. Hill, and he was called the Empire Builder. And he was Canadian. And he was trying to tap the mineral resources of British Columbia. But opposing him was the mighty CPR. And so they decided to put a line through in this area, which they were to call the Kettle Valley. And you know, they weren't too far off, because when you look at the map of the southern interior and all those old mining towns of the 1890s, the turn of the century, you had places like Nelson, you know, and the Silvery Slocan and Rossland, the old Golden City. Mm-hmm. Then you came down onto the boundary country and you had Grand Forks and Greenwood and Phoenix and Deadwood and all those old places in there. And then as you come through in the upper Kettle, you come into Beaverdell and into Carmi, and then once you get beyond the Okanagan Trough, that is beyond Penticton, you get into places like Olalla and Headley and Copper Mountain. So the whole area seemed to be shot through with mineral resources. And the interesting thing was, these Canadian mines tended to go to depth. They produced a lot of ore, whereas the American mines just on their side of the border didn't seem to produce that amount of ore.
And so the American line that James J. Hill, the Canadian, was building, and the CPR were vying to get to this place first.
Yeah. They wanted the lion's share of the ore trade.
Okay. We've got a lot of stories to tell about the Kettle Valley Rail Line, and we'll do that right after we come back from this break. The Kettle Valley Line, a remarkable piece of transportation corridor. Welcome back to Gold Trails and Ghost Towns. I'm Mike Roberts with Bill Barlee, and we're on the Kettle Valley Rail Line today. A really remarkable stretch of rail that started being built when? When was the line started?
Well, they had to survey it first, Mike.
Yeah.
So they took 3 major surveys. One south of where we're standing right now, some miles south, one some miles north, and then the line we're on now, which is the right-of-way of the Kettle Valley. This is the one they finally chose.
You mentioned J.J. Hill as being the Empire Builder. Who did the CPR have to come up against him?
No, J.J. Hill had a broader vision, but Andrew McCulloch was the one individual who should have tackled the line and did tackle the line.
But McCulloch was an accountant trained back east and only came out west on a bet. How did he ever get a job like building a railway?
Yeah, well, he took it on kind of off chance, per chance, and never thought that he would be that interested in railroading, evidently. But once they start railroading, Mike, you know, these railroaders tend to stay with it the rest of their days. And, you know, I've talked to railroaders when I was a kid, and there's something different about a railroader. You know, they're cut from a different cloth. These guys, and quite often the grandfather worked for the CPR, and then the father worked for the CPR, and now the son works for the CPR, and often on the same stretch of line.
And that's important. It's in the blood. I can't forget the first time I heard a steam whistle, for example.
Yeah. Well, sure, me too. I remember it with absolute detail. I can hear it today. I was 5 years old, living in the town of Grand Forks. And I was outside the house, and I could hear the whistle of the Great Northern all the way across and echoing across the valley. Mm-hmm. And I can hear that as well now as I could hear it 50 years ago.
Was there a final watershed, a final event which said, J.J. Hill, your history, Andrew McCulloch, you're the one in charge here?
J.J. Hill never forgot his dream of tapping the resources in Canada. And so he had feeder lines going into Canada in various different spots. But the CPR had the edge on them, because after all, they were a Canadian line, although J.J. Hill was a Canadian. And so they felt this would put the coup de grace to J.J. Hill. This would finish his plans of empire in Canada.
They actually got into some conflict along the way, didn't they?
Oh yes, they were almost an explosive situation just outside of Midway. I think it was 1909, and that was referred to kind of jocularly as the Midway War. But it didn't come to that. There were a lot of fist fights, but it didn't explode into actual gunfighting.
I actually seem to remember a historic photograph with one train track crossing another train track. Did it actually get to that, or was that?
Well, that was probably the hot air line crossing the CPR, but that did happen on a number of different areas in British Columbia, where you had a train coming right across another, because they both said they had right-of-ways through this particular area. So this was not unusual, but it's a great shot, the one you're alluding to.
Did they call the start of the Kettle Valley line Midway? Was that the original start of it?
Well, we look at it as Midway, but it isn't. It really goes back to the Robson area, so it's beyond Midway. It's east of Midway, through the Grand Forks region, through the Big Bulldog Tunnel, up McCrae Creek, and up over skirting the western part of the Arrow Lakes. But we're concentrating on the line from Midway to Penticton, which is a major section of the line.
Yeah. When I look at these trestles, I think of the surveyor. I've never fully understood surveying, how they can start a line in Midway and end it in Penticton and never have it go over a 2% grade the way railways have to be. It's miraculous to me.
Yeah, and they pretty well stayed with that, Mike. But these guys had to walk, first of all the proposed line and make sure that it didn't go over, as you say, 2%, although parts of the Kettle Valley in this area were over 2%. So it made it a difficult line, but it was the only way they could handle it. So the line up to, we'll say, McCulloch was relatively easy. But once you came down the eastern side or the western side of those mountains, down through Canyon Creek and all through there into Penticton itself, that was a much more difficult engineering feat.
We're standing in an area which is just between Myra Station, one of the stations on the Kettle Valley line, and Lorna.
Yeah.
In that length, how many trestles and how many tunnels are there?
Well, I think there were 11 trestles and bridges and 2 tunnels. And so this is unusual. Wasn't the average of the line, but the line all the way down from here to Penticton is very, very difficult engineering feat.
Now, what did Andrew McCulloch have to say about this? What did this man who's built this wonder have to say?
Well, Andrew McCulloch was really a very unusual human being. He was probably the best, almost self-taught engineer that the CPR had. He had other gifts as well. He loved Shakespeare. In fact, some of the stations he named all the way along the Kettle Valley, Othello and Romeo and
Iago.
Yeah, sure. All of these are Shakespearean characters, sure. And he would spend a lot of his spare time either reading Shakespeare or quoting it.
Spare time and building a place like this?
Well, when I say spare time, the only time he couldn't work was at night. So around the campfire, he'd be quoting Shakespeare or reading Shakespeare. Quite often to the crews, some of whom were quite well read themselves, surprisingly.
Well, was Andrew McCulloch a surveyor, or did he just employ surveyors and then go out and look at their findings? How did he work?
Well, he became a surveyor. And most of the surveyors, you see, Mike, you have to realize the turn of the century were self-taught. So he was no exception. And, you know, he started out as a bookkeeper, essentially, an accountant, and graduated, came into this by fluke, really, and became the best engineer, I think, on the whole Pacific Slope.
Now, what did that entail? Did he have to be both the coach that got the team revved up and said, yes, we can do it, and did he have to keep saying that to the boys back at the CPR headquarters, or how did he work, man to man?
I think they had the utmost confidence in this guy. He knew exactly what he was doing. And, you know, when he took a measurement, they said he could tell by eye how close it was. Quite often they would triangulate and whatever else they do, the engineers, and he'd say, no, you're off a few inches, and he would be right. On checking, he would be right. So McCulloch was, you know, and this was his love. Certainly the Kettle Valley was his crowning achievement.
The Kettle Valley was put here for him to come to world prominence.
Oh yeah, for sure, especially in the railway world. And you know, when it came into Penticton, it was a gala day. I mean, you know, the railroad crew had been working, hundreds and hundreds of men, varying whether they got to a trestle, which was a significant amount of work, or whether they were blasting a tunnel, which was also dangerous. And you know, you read some of the old newspapers in the area, in the Boundary Country or the Cascade Record, for instance, you'll find that there were casualties all the time, especially in the building of the tunnels, and a lesser number in the building of high trestles and so on.
When I take a look at all the different jobs there are in building a railway, did they have specialists? Did they bring in specialists to do each one of the jobs?
Well, you remember, it was tackled by 3 different groups, actually. Certainly the average railroad worker. Then the Chinese had a significant part of building this railway, and you can see the Chinese camps here and there, all the way along the line between Penticton and McCulloch. And of course, the great high steel men and the high bridge men were originally Iroquois Indians from the Six Nations. And whether they worked on the Kettle Valley or not, I don't know. I can't find any evidence that they did or did not.
Yeah. Who were navvies?
The navvies were the guys who did the bulwark. They were the pick and shovel guys.
They weren't the specialists.
No, they weren't paid as well either. Although they got a certain amount, but they weren't paid like the bridge workers or the blasters. And the blasters, of course, very dangerous business.
I see all the raw materials, the wood for the trestles, for example.
Yeah.
Did they cut down all the trees around here to make the beam supports for the trestles, or did they bring them in from somewhere else?
Well, they were usually brought in, Mike, on the work train, because they weren't going to waste time. It was all a campaign. It was like a campaign at war. They had certain times to get this bridge up, and if it was 400 feet long and 150 feet high, they had a certain amount of months to hit that, and they were not far off. I believe Andrew McCulloch brought the whole Kettle Valley line in within $12,000 of the original estimate. And that was a very careful estimate. $12,000 is astonishing.
Is there any accounting for the numbers of people who worked on it? Did these guys come up out of Kelowna? And we see Kelowna right from where we are here.
Yeah, it did affect the local area. So it affected Kelowna, it affected Penticton, because it brought cash into the country. And there wasn't a lot of cash. In fact, it's rather amusing because McCulloch used to travel with various of the CPR bigwigs. And a guy called V.V. Warren, I believe his name was, he had a trick he'd play on McCulloch all the time, and they went into Beaverdale, which wasn't very big at the time. Beaverdale was pretty small, and the Highland Bell was going, and a few other mines close by. Carmi was even smaller. And they'd have breakfast and stay overnight. And then Warren would present a bill, a $20 bill.
Well, the innkeeper, yeah.
That's right, the innkeeper at Smith House in Beaverdale had never seen a $20 bill. And he said, oh, I can't possibly change that. So who would have to dig into his pocket, of course, was McCulloch. And he got tired of it. He said, I'm going to change your bill, and eventually he did. And Warren got a huge kick out of it because he always ended up having McCulloch paying the bill, you see.
There must have been some amazing stories like that.
Oh, yeah. And you see, the interesting thing is that all the old railroaders, there were a lot of names. It seems every second railroader had a nickname, and they remember them for years, and they remember the details. And this is why books like McCulloch's Wonder were so well researched, because he went back and saw some of these guys who'd been on the line as young men, and these stories had been passed down from individual to individual, from father to son, sometimes from grandfather to father to son.
Yeah. It was important to keep it all alive, because people lost their lives here. Many people were,
Sure.
of course, all the horses, and I guess that were used in this had to come up from the valley bottom.
Oh, yeah, sure they did. And the thing is, the people in the Okanagan Valley knew that it was going to save the valley, because the valley at the time, now, we must consider the overall picture. The overall picture was that the stern wheelers generally were serving the valley. Mm-hmm. So they were dropping from Vernon to Kelowna to Penticton and to the various places like Gallatley's and so on all the way down. But now the railroad was going to be the savior. And when it came into Penticton on May the 30th, the first passenger train, there were trains in before that, May the 30th, 1950, this is a gala day. And, literally, the whole town turned out, including the dogs, which was unusual, because dogs generally do not like trains. They don't mix too well.
They hiss at them, don't they?
Yeah, they do.
The kind of
oh, yeah, they get afraid of the steam and the sound of the trains and everything else. But everybody was there, in all their finery.
So the contribution of the railway was was it considered a more, I guess, a secure freight route than, say, the boats were that going up and down? Was it more of a sign of permanence, the rail line, than of the boats?
Yeah, it was, and because the boats could get caught in the ice. And generally, this part of the Kettle Valley Railway was not like the Coquihalla area. The Coquihalla was some of the greatest snow belt in the world are in the Coquihalla. So this wasn't as bad. You'd keep this line open almost all the time, and it served many purposes. It brought produce in, it took produce out. It brought machinery in for the mines, and in World War I, it took out battalions like the 225th Kootenai and the 154th and the 2nd CMRs, and all these guys went back to the front in World War I. Many of them never came back, and it's really quite remarkable as you walk through the valley in various places like Kettle Valley. Valley, in just between Midway and Rock Creek. You'll see on the cenotaph there about 40 or 50 names. Simply wiped out. They were in the 225th and the 154th.
So when we see those historic photos, what a sad day.
Yeah, a lot of these guys, in some of those photographs, Mike, 1 out of 4 or 5 of these men returned. In other words,
1 out of 4 or 5
that's right, returned. I believe in one day the 154th Kootenai lost, they sent out 500 men on the Somme, and I believe they returned with 6 men. All the rest were killed or wounded or missing.
And right where we're standing, the Kettle Valley train took them back east.
Yes, well, eventually they made the connection, that's right.
Yeah. Standing here on the right-of-way, the grade of the Kettle Valley Railway, with all the trestles still in existence, what's the future for it, do you think?
Well, I consider it, when you examine the overall structure of the Kettle Valley and its historic importance, and also that although the rail is gone, Mike, and so are the ties, but everything else is here. The engineering has been done. The right-of-way is still here, the tunnels are still here, in generally good shape, and the trestles and bridges are still here, generally in above-average condition. So I think that it should be preserved, and I think the city of Penticton is moving towards this now, where they are negotiating with the CPR to preserve that part of the right-of-way within the city limits of Penticton. And I think the rest of it will probably be saved then, because then it becomes an ideal biking or hiking trail. And eventually, who knows, down the line, it may even be resurrected.
Welcome back to Gold Trails and Ghost Towns. Mike Roberts with Bill Barley on the Kettle Valley Rail Line in the Okanagan. Down at the end of this trestle we're sitting on, an excellent example of some of the specialty men at work.
Yeah, these are the stonemasons. Most of them Italian origin, many of them came right from Italy. And they were put to work on all the stonework on most of the approaches.
There's cribbing all along the rail line, and that seems to me that it says that this was more than just a job. There's a lot of love and respect went into the place.
Oh yeah, these guys, some of these guys can point out where their fathers laid the stonework. People living in Penticton, mostly in Penticton, because that was a divisional point then. Yeah.
Got a great photograph. It's probably staged, but it shows a poker game in progress.
Yeah. Well, these guys, you know, time hung heavy on their hands, and the section crews were sometimes spent several days bottled up, and they would play a lot of poker, and sometimes high-stakes games, although the company generally did not approve of that.
And this had to be posed because the guy in the background had to hold the bottle for a long time, because this is a long exposure indoors. It's great.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah, it's one of the typical railroad shots. These guys were playing games, and they wanted to commemorate it.
Railroading had its hazards, and there were a few wrecks on this line.
Yeah, there were a number of wrecks, not as serious as on the western portion of the line, the runaway train, but there were wrecks all along this section, which is understandable. And the one we're looking at in this photograph is a wreck that took place close to Beaverdale, and the engineer, a guy named Crosley, was killed in this particular wreck. So it was a dangerous sort of way to make a living.
You, even though your specialty is mines and prospectors and stuff, you've taken the Kettle Valley to your heart. You know Barry Sanford, who wrote the book quite well, and talking. What have we got here? This is a very heavy. This is not like your tiny little miner's lantern. Where'd you get that?
That's one of the station lights. Originally came off the Kettle Valley line, and you'll see CPR right in front of it. So this is typical, made to last, and indeed they did last. Yeah. And they weren't too much different than the Great Northern lamps either.
Where does this come from? This is your. This looks like it called occasionally people to lunch.
And a lot louder than that when you hit it right.
Well, and you don't hold it on this hand. It was hung by
it was hung, and so it much more resonance. And this was the triangle, camp triangle, used in railway camps, used in mining camps, and everything, Mike.
This is obviously something that came out of Mr. McPherson's hand.
Yes, actually that belonged to a long-time CPR man called Pearlie McPherson in Penticton, and he passed on some years ago, and the Penticton Museum loaned us this particular one because he wore it with pride for many, many years.
We've seen the shot already, of course, of the trains coming into Penticton, and they had the passenger service with all the best CPR cutlery.
Oh yes, at its best, it was really unsurpassed, and
I think we should leave the people with a real taste of it I mean, there was some film shot here for the National Dream, Pierre Berton's great film, but someone else took some film while Pierre was having his film shot.
Yeah, an old friend of mine, Randy Manuel, shot some film, so I think we should end off with that.
And this shows some of the trains that were gathered here for Pierre Berton's National Dream, but courtesy Randy Manuel at the Penticton Museum.
Correct.
Thanks, Bill. It's been great,
Mike.
Visiting on the Kettle Valley line.